Welcome, everyone. We are so glad to have you here today. I know we have a nice large crowd joining us remotely for this important webinar and virtual fireside chat on supporting the social sector through virtual pro bono programming. In order to get a little bit of a feel of who's here, we definitely suggest you also take advantage of the chat window in order to introduce yourself with your name and the company or organization that you're with, so folks can have the chance to see who is joining us here as well. But I will be able to be the one kicking us off. My name is Lindsay Gruber. I am the president and CEO of the Taproot Foundation, and I'm so grateful to everyone for making the time to be here today for this really important topic. For us in particular, as we think about the role that pro bono service can play during this time of crisis, one of the elements that's so essential is understanding the context in which we're all operating, and maybe most importantly, the context in which the nonprofits we're all trying to serve are operating. So today we want to make sure we have the time together to talk about how this can happen well. And in order to do that, we're going to be sharing with you some of the best practices that the Taproot Foundation has had the chance to come to learn over the many years we've been doing pro bono, and in particular, running virtual pro bono programming. We have an esteemed guest with us, Dan Kamens. I'm from MetLife, and you'll hear a little bit more from him and about him later. And we hope you'll be able to add your own examples and thoughts to this conversation as well. One thing I'll add, as I'm sure many of you have already experienced in many other forums, most of these large webinar formats are having difficulty with the connectivity and the platform. So if you find yourself having any issues, 3 quick pointers. One is use Google Chrome if you're on your computer. We do find that's better. The second is you'll find the audio is actually probably going to be more consistent if you're able to use your computer audio to listen instead of your phone. And last, and maybe most importantly, if you aren't able to hear well, or even if you want to make sure you have a refresher, we are recording this and we'll make sure we send around the recording. That way you're able to have a nice high quality version to be able to reflect back on and to share. So with that, as I mentioned, I want to set the stage for you of the conversation that we're having today. Many of you, thankfully, have already dove headfirst into finding ways that your companies or organizations can find out the critical needs that nonprofit organizations are facing right now and establish ways to help them. And first and foremost, one thing we want to continue to emphasize is that what these organizations really need the most right now is funding. In addition to funding, we want to help make sure that you're armed and able to find the ways to really meet these organizations where they are and provide them support in the most valuable way possible. So with that, we have a few key pieces we're going to make sure we can cover today. For those of you who are new to us and wondering what role the Taproot Foundation plays in understanding the world of pro bono service, I'll give you just a quick outline of that, as it really helps to set the stage for how we've come to understand the way that high quality pro bono can come to life and how we've had the chance to work with great partners like MetLife Foundation in making these amazing programs happen. And then you'll hear real world example and being able to see what this can really look like and the key considerations for you to think about as you're hopefully considering designing or shifting your own pro bono programs to help organizations in need. And then, because we like to end everything on a note of action, we'll be sharing some resources that can hopefully help you find ways to jump in right away, and leaving some space for questions, which you can use the chat field for. And as I mentioned, we'll be sending around a recording. So hopefully that can also spur some additional thinking for you, and you'll have the chance to reach back out if any questions come up for you at the end of this. So a quick overview for those of you who are new to us, Taproot itself is a nonprofit organization, and our focus is helping to make sure that the other organizations out there that are driving social good get access to the support they need through pro bono service. Many of you think of pro bono service as being consistent with the legal profession, and that is definitely a noble aspect of pro bono, but we know just how important it is to make sure that marketing, IT, HR, finance, all those other types of needs are also able to be met. We've done that through running our own pro bono programming, in addition to working with over 100 companies and helping them design and scale their pro bono programs as well. And the main pillars of our programming that have helped drive our understanding now of how pro bono happens well are across the categories I mentioned, in addition to thought leadership. So making sure that we can have virtual convenings like this, put out pieces share best practices so that we can ensure that everyone engaging in pro bono service is armed with the information to do it as well and effectively as possible. And in light of such a changing environment in which we're all operating, the other piece that's really helped us build a strong understanding of what's necessary for virtual pro bono is our own online platform for pro bono, which is Taproot Plus, that is entirely fueled by nonprofits' free access and volunteers' free access to be able to use the platform to post pro bono project needs, get matched together, and do the pro bono virtually. So all these pieces for us have really helped build a strong understanding of what it takes for pro bono to happen well. And in particular, for those of you who are joining us from companies, what you might have to think about as you're trying to build out the strategy for a program, the ways you can define success, what you have to consider in order to bring the right type of programming to life. We've had to spend a lot of time digging in to understand the key aspects of implementation, evaluation, scaling, all those components to make sure programs can happen thoughtfully and are really on the right path to achieve the goals you want to have. And as I mentioned, putting out thought leadership, making sure we can work with partners so that rising tide can really lift all boats and ensuring that good pro bono can happen. And it's bringing that knowledge to the table that has really enabled us to jump quickly into making sure we can set up webinars like this to help make sure that everyone else out there looking to make amazing virtual pro bono happen right now can be armed with the right information. And so with that, and speaking of expertise, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jenny Diaz, who can jump right into this really important topic.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. As Lindsay said, my name is Jenny Diaz. I'm the Interim Managing Director of the Advisory Services team here at Taproot. And I'm excited to speak with you guys a bit more about what virtual pro bono is, how it works, some tips and tricks that you can keep in mind when you're thinking about building or adapting your own pro bono programs. And I'll be having a really great conversation with Dan Kamens in a little bit to go in deep on his virtual pro bono program at the MetLife Foundation. And I think while Lindsay set this up really well as to why this conversation is particularly important right now, it's also good to keep in mind that virtual pro bono isn't necessarily new, and it's something that many practitioners have implemented in the past to meet different goals. So to that end, something that can really help take the pressure off of all of us is just thinking about what virtual pro bono is and the fact that virtual in itself is just a design parameter. Just like if you were to decide to use a particular skill set or run a program within a one-day time span versus a one-year time span, you're just going to be considering different things in order to make sure that you're achieving the goals that you're trying to accomplish. And so therefore, virtual pro bono is an amazing way to still be able to help beneficiaries meet a wide variety of needs, whether they're short-term, like quick diagnostic support of something's not working, we need to figure it out, speedy troubleshooting, tactical problem solving and solution building, or longer term strategic support. No matter what it is, you can figure out how to do that in a virtual format relatively easily. And that allows us to be super flexible right now in this situation, so we can really help nonprofits who might just need a quick answer get the support that they need. It is important to also keep in mind what virtual pro bono isn't. So it's not just designing a program that would otherwise be in person and just throwing people to Zoom and saying, good luck. That wouldn't necessarily set them up for success. And there are things that you want to keep in mind, some changes you might want to make to your design so that it can be successful in a virtual setting. And it's also not just relevant when you're physically unable to be in person. There are other reasons why building a virtual program might make sense for you that you could think about to medium term and long term as well. For instance, it can be a really great way to make pro bono a bit more accessible for folks who can't carve out the time to be, moving to one particular in-person event on a particular day. They can have a little bit more flexibility on their schedule to do pro bono work. So in order to that end of thinking about virtual as just a design parameter where you're kind of flexing and figuring out how you might need to adapt other things, we thought it might be helpful to walk through one of our favorite frameworks here at Taproot, the Pro Bono Sweet Spot. So this framework is something that we apply anytime we're thinking about designing or redesigning any program to make sure that we're considering all the major categories of design decisions to ultimately arrive at the pro bono program design that will ultimately achieve your goal. So we'll talk about social sector need, skills and expertise you're engaging, business objectives, and context and constraints. So what I'll do right now is just quickly walk through each of those categories from the perspective of you've made the decision that running a pro bono program virtually is really important. What does that allow you to do in some of these other categories? And what might you need to just consider and plan around? So let's start with social impact. You'll want to think about what social impact you can make with any program you run. And this should be first and foremost in some of the other decisions you're making too. Like any type of in-person opportunity, it still allows you to support one or more issue areas that are important to your company just by the virtue of the organizations you decide to support. But it could also provide you an opportunity to offer support to a broader pool of beneficiaries. While sometimes you might be constrained by the amount of space you're able to secure for a particular pro bono in-person opportunity or event, that's not the case in a virtual setting. And depending on your own bandwidth to manage those projects, you might be able to just include a few more folks, which is often really great. It also provides you an opportunity to deepen your impact in communities across geographies. You're not limited by the organizations that are near the talent that you want to use because it needs to be in person with that talent. You can decide to support that organization you love in Tulsa in the same program as the organization you love in New Orleans. So it gives you some flexibility there and having an impact across different communities. And it also, and very importantly, can help meet beneficiaries where they are. They're not, if an organization is in a little bit more of a rural setting and would otherwise have driven an hour and a half to meet you in person to get that support, they don't have to do that. It releases some of that burden, it makes it a bit more acceptable for organizations, which is something that's particularly important right now. The next category we'll briefly talk about is around skills and expertise. So what kind of skills and expertise can really complement a virtual pro bono program? The short answer is any other skills and expertise you would use for an in-person program. There's really not a huge difference here, but a couple of things to keep in mind, a couple of advantages and considerations. One, this could be an opportunity for you to engage additional skill sets that you don't normally tap into, and or double down on engaging common skill areas that your company is really known for. Kind of like I was talking about before, it gives you a great opportunity to grab the talent that you need, regardless of where they sit. So you can go pretty deep in some skill areas. It also allows you to tap into skill sets and expertise areas that otherwise might be a little bit out of bounds if you're thinking about an in-person opportunity. We hear from a lot of companies that in some cases, they have a lot of field staff that might be traveling a lot or on their own working virtually. And an in-person program can be kind of hard to engage those people. If it's virtual, it's much easier. And you might be able to use some of that expertise that otherwise isn't necessarily being tapped into to support your partners. One consideration to keep in mind is that some skill areas will require a little bit more time to get to a productive outcome, however, through a virtual project. So while you can still help a nonprofit, for example, think about the way that they're using their space to benefit their beneficiaries, without being able to do an in-person site visit, you might need to get creative. Maybe use some video. Maybe you're just adding a little bit more time to add a few more interviews to talk to more people to really get that full picture of what the challenge is. So make sure that you're just being creative and accounting for being able to get to the right outcome with the skill sets that you're engaging. The next bucket here is around business objectives. So like any in-person pro bono program, it can still help you achieve a lot of the most common business objectives we see, such as building your brand. But there's some specific advantages or things that you can keep in mind related to virtual. So one is that by engaging folks to work in a virtual setting, you're preparing your leaders for a new work environment. I think we're seeing this across the board. Everybody's having to learn very quickly how to build rapport across different locations in a virtual setting. This is a great way to continue to flex that muscle. It also, to that end, allows folks to build their comfort with navigating change, and it can also stimulate innovation. People are not only applying their expertise in a new context related to understanding a nonprofit context, but they're also able to experiment with how they build team across different locations where they're not able to meet face to face. And some of the things they might learn there could really help them in their day-to-day job. It also allows for you to really focus on building an inclusive and interconnected workforce. If you're staffing pro bono teams to execute on a project where you've got people sitting in completely different locations across different lines of business, you can build a greater understanding of what's happening even within your own company. One of my favorite things to hear in a program is when at the end an employee says, you know what, like I had no idea we even did that thing that my colleague was able to bring up in this call and in this project. So that's a really exciting benefit as well. Especially right now, it's important that this is an opportunity to connect people to purpose and using their skills in a way that feels like it can help benefit society. Then it can also maximize the impact of your existing initiatives. You may be giving great organizations money. You can help that money go even further by helping them build their capacity to withstand challenges in the future as well. So those three buckets cover a lot of the things that you'll want to think about from a higher level in terms of who you're engaging. And it's kind of a similar thought process you go through in any type of pro bono program. But we'll focus in a little bit more in depth here on some of the constraints that you might want to design around and really think about carefully when you're applying virtual as a program constraint. So you're going to want to think more carefully about logistics, about expectation setting, and about team building and team structure. So we'll go into each of these in a little more depth using a real example of a program that we've recently needed to convert from an in-person model to a virtual model. So this program is what we call the Pro Bono Marathon. We've run it with a lot of different companies over the years and on our own as well. And the objective of this program is to provide each nonprofit organization that takes part with a concrete solution to a discrete challenge. The work happens over the course of an in-person event, though there's also some pre-work that is already meant to be virtual. So a virtual training, a prep call, and some prep work. It usually happens on site at a corporation or another event space on the day of. And we're engaging, anywhere from 3 to 15 organizations and an equivalent number of teams and volunteers, about 3 to 5 volunteers per project. And they're digging in on that pre-scoped need. So in the next few slides, I'll talk in each of these categories about some things you'll want to keep in mind irregardless of model, and then a few examples of how this is coming to life as we're redesigning the virtual marathon itself. So as far as logistical considerations go, you want to keep a few things in mind related to technology, which is one of the first things that people think about. So carefully considering what tech platform you're using and recommending, and thinking about what some of the capabilities are there. Like, for instance, I know that some platforms provide a chance for you to have a whiteboard. So maybe that's a benefit, or breakout rooms. So just think about what they can do and what you'd like to set folks up to be able to do within the project. And you'll also want to recommend some virtual collaboration tools. So are people using Google Docs to collaborate? Something else, Stormboard is something that we've actually used internally at Taproot a lot. It allows for virtual brainstorming. You can create little post-its. It's pretty fun. So just think through what some of those tools could be and provide recommendations to folks. You'll also want to ensure that teams have access to a document sharing repository, and that you've thought through if there's any issues related to firewalls or sensitivity of information as to which is most appropriate. You'll want to be mindful of how you're recommending that work is paced. So while in an in-person setting, you might say, okay, we're just going to be able to tell them on the day of an event that they're going to have a break at this point. Like, you need to just be more mindful of communicating that proactively. And to my earlier point, maybe you need to have a little bit more time accounted for to get the work done. And you also want to make sure that you're building contingency plans for any tech issues that may arise. So if your chosen platform just doesn't work on the day of, what do? just have some plans in place. What's a backup platform? Are you allowing people to just pick their own and let you know what they're using? Have those things in mind. So for the example of the virtual marathon, as we've converted that from in-person to virtual, we're instructing teams to use their video conferencing technology on their connector call, the advanced prep call, to practice logging into the platform. So there are no surprises when they get on and want to just have that dedicated work time on the day of the event. We're also training all participants together. Sometimes we do that separately, but we've been training together to ensure that everybody's receiving the same logistical information, regardless of who is responsible for a key logistic. Making sure everyone knows what needs to happen because there's so many little things is really important. And then we're also going to be suggesting break times. In an in-person event, we have a time where we break for lunch and we let everybody know they can come and grab that food. That won't happen if we're just giving people that 5-hour chunk of time to work. So we will recommend to teams when they might think to break and take a little bit of a breather. The next category is around expectation setting considerations. So this is really important to make sure that everybody's on the same page and understands what they're doing. Always important, critical when it's virtual. You want to ensure that participants know what they're signing up for from the outset, from a timing perspective, preparation, the skills needed, et cetera, et cetera. But you also want to make sure they really understand the implications of working in a virtual format. And sometimes that will be an exciting challenge for folks. Sometimes they may not want to do that, or they may find it a little bit more challenging. And so you want them to know what they're signing up for at the outset. You want to think carefully about project outcomes, and if you're redesigning a program, maybe redefine a little bit. Some virtual collaboration may take a little bit longer. It just does. And projects may need to be sized down in order to be accomplished to the objective that you're setting up. You want to provide troubleshooting and quality control measures. So do you have a designated email for people to submit questions? Are you going to be available on one particular video conference line for live support throughout the course of a program? Just building in even more intentional points to check in on how things are going, because it's a little harder to see. And then provide opportunities for giving feedback and course correcting within the program structure. Make sure that people feel empowered and you're giving them specific advice on how to garner feedback to promote really good communication. So whether it's giving them a three-question questionnaire and saying, at this point in your project, you should absolutely sit down with your team and have this conversation, or it's something else, like just put something in place. As far as the virtual marathon goes, I'm going to wait for my slide come back. Okay, great. In training, you'll want to underscore that, we're putting a lot of parameters in place. We're putting a lot of supports in place for success in this setting. But ultimately, we want to make sure that people are able to be flexible and adaptable to approach the work as necessary. So if they need to take an hour break in the middle, or break apart in a way that might not happen in an in-person setting, that's totally fine. We want to make sure they're ultimately able to just achieve what they're trying to get to. And we'll also want to check in with teams. We're also planning to check in with teams before the event day to ensure that participants clearly understand expectations. When in an in-person setting, you can kind of feel that out as you're watching work start, but we won't have that benefit in a virtual setting. So intentionally checking in with team leads to make sure that they're comfortable with what they're going to be doing walking into the day, just getting a little bit more in the weeds with teams so they're ultimately set up for success. And then the last bucket here is around team building considerations. And team building is probably the most critical thing. If a team doesn't gel or work well together, that's going to make or break your project. So you'll want to emphasize this even more than you would in an in-person setting. You'll want to require teams to connect and establish roles before the program begins and be really explicit about those roles. The team lead is an absolutely critical role. It usually is, but in this setting, it's even more important that that person is comfortable navigating in ambiguity, that they are well prepared to build team and check in with people in this virtual way. So that's a role that you probably want to designate in advance. But the others, you can provide the team with some discretion to assign themselves. The other role that I'll quickly just highlight is a culture keeper. So we often we regularly do want people to develop agreed upon norms for staying engaged, for communication. This is even more important in a virtual setting. So it could be great to designate somebody to specifically be watching out for those things. So it's not all on the team lead to watch out for if some of the norms are starting to slide a little bit. And the last thing I'll highlight here is around providing recommended icebreakers to help teams establish rapport. I know icebreakers can feel a little cheesy sometimes, but they're incredibly important for getting people comfortable and starting conversation, building that kind of personal level empathy and understanding that can only benefit the project when they start to get into messier conversations. So what is this looking like in our virtual marathon format? One, we're instructing employee teams to schedule a meeting before the marathon so that they, on their own after the connector call, so they can establish rapport and they can share their expertise and really get to know who they're working with, what they can lean on each other for, and align on their approach for the day of. And also do a little bit of more testing of the technologies that they want to use for collaboration. And then we're also going to be continuing to host, as we would in our normal in-person marathon, some sort of kickoff activity as well as a debrief at the end of the day to provide a cohort experience, really set the tone and be able to share learnings and celebrate successes. A really important thing about a lot of these programs is that it's not just an organization getting support with their specific challenge. It's an opportunity to also learn from other people's challenges that they may also be experiencing on the side. So maintaining some of those pieces is really important. And for the debrief activity in particular, where it's usually more conversation based, might need to put a little bit more structure around asking people to present on what they're doing, and maybe there's a little bit more chat activity than you might see in some of an in-person settings. So those are some of the considerations that have come most top of mind for us when we're thinking about adapting our model there. And that's just one example of how you can think about a virtual pro bono program. Love to spend the next 20 minutes or so now talking about another program. So we have Dan Kamens here, who's joining us from the MetLife Foundation. He's a director of employee engagement and volunteerism. And we've been partnering with him over the last several years on a variety of different pro bono programs. But we recently, last year actually, had a chance to work with him on this Inclusion Plus pro bono program, which was designed to be virtual from the start. So love to just take a few minutes to have Dan introduce himself and talk a little bit about the foundation's work related to pro bono before we dig in even further.
Sure, happy to do that. And sorry to anybody who's hearing some background noise from my 2-year-old who is currently actively fighting a nap and trying to not go down. But yeah, happy to be on the call and to share a little bit about the program today. I'll start with just a kind of a high level of what the pro bono initiatives that we have done in partnership with Taproot have looked like. For those of you who don't know or haven't heard speak about our engagement work and our overall grant making work, we primarily focus on financial health. But our overall portfolio from a volunteerism perspective is pretty varied. We do quite a bit of pro bono work with Taproot. That includes single day and long-term pro bono service. And a few years ago, we ran a competition program over the course of 3 years in 12 different countries called Inclusion Plus. And in this program, we were looking for socially minded ventures and nonprofits who would apply for a competitive program, and the winners from each country, so 2 to 3 winners from each country, would receive financial support to further their work as they were kind of launching these either nonprofits or for-profit socially minded ventures. Over the course of those 3 years, we had over 1,000 volunteers engaged. We conducted a global convening at the end of the program, and we realized that as the program wrapped up, we didn't want to be done with these colleagues. There was more to be done. There were more opportunities for us to continue to support the ventures and really for us to leverage the skills and expertise of our employees. So we worked with Taproot to run our first ever virtual pro bono program, which ran last year, to connect employees with the ventures that needed specific skills over the course of 12 weeks. Obviously, times have changed, right? So I'm not going to try to square peg round hole the situation and say that this is going to be perfect right now for what we would be doing or what anybody else would be doing. But we did see quite a bit of success in engaging employees on specific teams from around the world as they were able to support nonprofit and for-profit ventures address immediate challenges that they were facing. So it's kind of a little bit of background there. And Jenny, I think I'll toss it back to you to us on the fireside chat, social distance fireside chat.
So here's our great fire. Great for the middle of the day to just relax by a fireplace that's virtual. So thank you for that overview, Dan. It's really helpful. I guess to dig in a little bit more there, what would you say some of the most important objectives were for you in setting up this program, and how did virtual make sense to achieve those objectives?
Sure. So I think, as we were looking at the objectives, first and foremost, we wanted to build deeper engagement with these ventures that we had worked with over the course of multiple years, right? So we didn't want to just say, this is great, we give you money, please go on your way. We wanted to say, this is great, here's some funding, but also we will support you and we will continue to work with you and give you resources that you otherwise would not be able to get. So that was kind of the primary objective. The secondary objective was to engage our employees and to make the MetLife world, we're a global company, we have 47,000 employees, to make the MetLife world feel a little bit smaller by connecting people who otherwise likely would not connect on a day-to-day basis. And then the third piece there is we recognize that our employees have expertise that probably goes beyond the scope of what a small for-profit or a nonprofit venture would have, but also that the challenges that our employees address in the US might be very different than they address in LATAM or EMEA or Asia Pacific. And as a result, we knew that if we were able to bring those groups together, we would build a stronger team for the ventures that we were working with. So that was kind of the third goal of the program.
Mm-hmm. And did you at any point consider just flying everybody to the same place or doing some sort of in-person workaround there?
So we had flown the winning ventures all to New York to kind of kick this off at the final summit for the 3-year program. But once we did that, we quite honestly just don't have the budget to do that and didn't have the opportunity to do that. We did consider doing it more locally, so just doing local pro bono projects where we would get the expertise of local individuals working with their local venture. But we realized that overall, the expertise just wasn't going to be as deep or as refined if we say, for example, our global brand and marketing team, which primarily sits in New York, if we didn't leverage that team for a brand and marketing challenge, it just wasn't going to have the same quality or outcomes that we would have liked to have.
Yeah, that's a really important call out. It's what we were talking about before too, of like the importance and the benefit of being able to use the skills you need regardless of where they sit to just address the need that's right there. And thinking about this program in comparison to some of the in-person models that you've run, what felt different?
All of it. So, I mean, I think there's the obvious, right? So when you're not meeting in person, there is significantly more attention that needs to be paid to team building. You mentioned that before in the slides that you were talking through, that you really have to make a concerted effort to not only put together the right team, but to ensure that they're gelling in a way that is going to work well. And that's a lot easier to do when you know the people that you're working with. That kind of leads into a second point, which is when we're doing a pro bono program, whether it's a single day or long term, and it's based out of one office, we usually have, if it's the office that I sit in or office where we have people that we work with regularly, we have a close connection to the employees and the nonprofits or the for-profits that we're working. In this case, we just didn't have that. And we had a connection to the Inclusion Plus ventures because we knew them, but for some of them, we hadn't talked to them in 2 years. So they were growing, they were having meetings on their own that we just had no line of sight into what their challenges were or what they needed. And on top of that, our employees who wanted to be a part of this program, we knew out of the 44 volunteers, we probably knew 5 or 10 of them. The rest of them were new to us and new to Pro Bono. I think that having regular check-ins, making sure roles and responsibilities are being followed, really ensuring that every virtual component is kind of given probably 5 to 10 times more attention than an in-person component would, just to make sure that it's working well. And then finally, and I think this one's rather obvious, it's a lot less human, right? Like this right now is a lot less human than if we were at the Taproot Summit sitting next to each other with a room full of people. And I think you just have to be willing to address that off the bat and just say, this is potentially going to feel funny. There's going to be tech challenges. There's going to be all kinds of issues, but we're in it together and we have to embrace it together.
Yeah. And if anything, that brings people together too. When something crazy goes, sideways on a technology basis, it can be kind of a fun moment for people to be like, okay, yeah, we're all human. We're all just dealing with this. It's totally fine.
Exactly.
Great. Can you talk a little bit more about the impact on kind of both sides of the coin for the volunteers and for the organizations that you benefited? What did you see as a result?
Yeah, so we ran 8 different projects. I would say 6 or 7 of them were really successful. 1 or 2 of them were successful, but just not quite as successful, being candid. I think that the ventures that we worked that had the best solutions were really able to gain substantive solutions or ideas to address the challenges and the specific issues that they were facing. Some of the challenges that were best suited to kind of get the results they needed were challenges around expanding to other countries, challenges around strategy, and other pieces like that. For employees, I think the largest gains were around the opportunity to leverage skills and to grow their network, right? So many of the people that participated were able to report back to their teams on what they were working on, were able to get the opportunity to present in front of large groups around this, and to leverage this type of project as more of a quote unquote reach project that they were able to participate in, all while expanding their understanding of what not only their business looks like globally, but what other businesses or lines of business within the company are working on a regular basis. One last thing to plug in terms of the Taproot partnership was we were able to host at the beginning of this project, and then at the 12-week mark at the end, we hosted joint meetings where people not only heard about the specific project that they were working on, but they also heard about a subset of other projects that were taking place. So they, again, got a little bit of a deeper understanding of what the ventures were facing and what our employees could bring to the table in terms of skills to solve those challenges.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. It's great to hear all of those benefits that might not be as possible in an in-person setting. When you think about the projects that went really well and the ones that struggled a little bit, what were some of the key differences?
Yeah, so I think there are probably 2 or 3 things. So one is just the overall leadership of the team. So we were able to assign project leads in different roles and responsibilities. And where we had the most success, we had the project leads communicating with us pretty regularly, telling us what was going on, telling us the challenges that they faced. Where we were less successful, the groups were a little bit less transparent with us. So that's kind of on us, and we could be more communicating in that sense. The ventures had different levels of responsivity as well, right? So it's a 12-week program. Obviously, we're all living this right now where life happens and things come up and things get in the way. And for some of the ventures with a very small staff, perhaps as small as 1 or 2 people, if a curveball got thrown into their day-to-day work, all of a sudden they were onto something else and they weren't paying as much attention to this. So I think that was another challenge. And the last thing, and again, this is something that we've talked about and something that's probably rather obvious, is just technology is always a challenge. And I think that where we are the only benefit potentially to come out of this current situation that we're all facing is that we're all getting a lot more used to working through technology and kind of working around the tech issues that will inevitably come up. But 9 months ago when we launched our program, I don't think we were in that same place. And I think a couple of groups got very discouraged very quickly when there were some tech issues right away.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of important things in what you just shared too. Like, one, making sure that the organization is ready for what you're offering them, and trying to help them look ahead enough of, if something does come up, does this still work for you, or maybe it's not the time. And that's particularly relevant right now, is really thinking carefully about what the most pressing needs are. And I know there's some questions around how we can best support organizations right now and be responsive to them. It's having really great, really open and transparent conversations with them. We've had a lot of those over the last few weeks with some of our nonprofit partners. And also then thinking, and what we're seeing most pop up are in the short term, just needs to get another ear, get that expert support. In longer term, some of the broader capacity building support in areas they may not have thought about before. So that's one thing. But what I also loved about what you were highlighting, Dan, is the importance of that team lead role and how having someone who is comfortable navigating those changes can make or break it, and what we as program implementers can do to like almost over-engineer the supports we're giving them. So if they don't need it, great, but if they do, we're giving them as much as possible to make sure they're going to be successful.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think I saw a question pop up too that was about the project manager lead and if they had project management experience, right? And where we could, we did, but that's not always the case. That you're not going to find, if you're doing 8 projects, 8 people with really strong project management skills that also have the skills of the specific challenge that you're facing. So I think it's, again, a little bit of that one is a little bit of a square peg round hole where sometimes you find it and it's great. And sometimes you don't, and you're training them as you go, or you're hoping that they can just use their everyday organizational skills to kind of help them through the challenges they're going to face.
Yeah, and I think what we like to do in those cases is just pressure check with the person that they understand, they're excited about it being a growth opportunity for one, if it's not in an area where they currently excel, and 2, that they understand that it is a growth opportunity and therefore will require a bit more of them to do it successfully, and give them the tools, and they just need to be willing. And that is often the difference as well if they don't have that expertise already.
Yeah.
Well, so maybe a little bit of a tricky question, but obviously this program was designed and implemented and piloted last year, and this was well before any of our current situation with the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic. What, if anything, might be different? If anything, what might be different? What you might think about differently if you were trying to run this program, say later this year, as things kind of settle out a little bit more?
Yeah. So all of it would be different. I think there's a bunch of things that need to be taken into account. So for this specific program, I think we would try to keep the design relatively similar, but I think we would reconsider whether or not it's the right program to be running at this time. I do think when it comes from our direct learnings from this program, I think that we overreached on locations in terms of number of locations and depth of locations. So we ran into challenges around there being multiple time zones on one team. So I think 2 time zones on one team is fine, but 3 is entirely too many. And I think looking at the current situation, I probably would be significantly more mindful of potentially limiting it to no more than a 2 to 3 hour span, because I think we're all facing in this new normal, at least for those of us who have kids or little kids, as I mentioned at the top of this session, my new normal is I get to work for 15 minutes and then I have to deal with a tantrum for 10 minutes. And if we are not similarly aligned in terms of time zone, there's a decent shot that none of that work is going to happen, or it's going to be really hard to do anything. I think that it's also a good time to really encourage employees who might have a little bit more flexibility, right? So if we're being truly honest with ourselves, this is not a good time for me to volunteer for a program. It's just not. It's not going to be until I can get back to some type of normal schedule and routine. But if there are people who don't have kids or are finding themselves bored being at home all the time or whatever, this might actually be a good chance to take on a little bit more. But then I think the last piece here is our program was a 12-week program. And again, I don't think I would change that. But I do think that what I would do at this moment is look for short-term quick wins. I would look for single touch point projects, moments in time where you're giving an hour or 2 hours of your expertise, not giving 12 weeks of your time, multiple hours every week. Because I just think that in this moment, there are tons of organizations who really could use the expertise or the skills of employees with a broad set of skills. And if they are being, if if they're being proactive about it, that might look like a 2-hour session or a 1-hour session and not a multi-day session.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a lot of what we're starting to pull together now too, or some programs that are just providing that quick hit support, where it's available more on a rolling basis. You're able to engage employees as they have time to support nonprofits, as they have quick pressing questions that come up, like giving them that hour to our space to just dig in, get someone's expertise, and go on with their lives. So it's a really important call out. If you were to, just thinking about the organizations that took part last year in this program, if you were to think about what some of the needs that they might be facing right now are, that could be addressed through pro bono, is there anything that comes top of mind to you?
That was not a question you prepped me for.
Sorry, I just had to know if it's okay if you have it.
No, you know what? Honestly, with the ventures that we worked with on this program, I'm not totally sure that they would need specific things other than talking about how to work with those who have recently lost their jobs or those who are facing new economic realities that they just were not anticipating. I think that just from the nonprofits that I work with regularly and have talked to, there are a lot of groups that have lost significant funding streams. There are a lot of groups who are trying to figure out how to survive and how to, especially with the $2 trillion relief package, trying to figure out exactly what they can do to use that money effectively as well to ensure that they're able to still pay their employees. Now, I don't know what the expertise is or the skill set is that employees internally would be bringing to the table to know that yet, but I think that those are the kinds of questions that are going to come up pretty regularly going forward.
Yeah, and in some cases it might just be getting another smart person coming from a slightly different perspective to be able to help you think about it. No one's going to have the answers right now, so it's just being able to put our brains together to figure something out.
Mm-hmm.
So I know we're getting close on time. One last question before we move into Q&A, or wrap it up and then move into Q&A. What advice would you give to another company that's thinking about running a pro bono program virtually?
Yeah, so a few things. So one, I think Lindsay said this before, there is a very real possibility that right now an organization needs money more than they need volunteers or pro bono skills, right? So if that's the case, I think you need to just make sure it's the right fit. And I'm not suggesting that the two are mutually exclusive, but what MetLife has done is basically repurposed the large majority of our grant making budget this year to go towards COVID-19 programming. That is not going to impact our volunteer budget, and it's not going to impact the volunteer work that we do. But if funding is truly the most important thing, then that's one piece that we just need to be aware of, and you should talk to nonprofits about. As I mentioned earlier, logistics can be tricky, so being organized around all of this is really important. But then I think the last two pieces that I would talk about or would mention are, one is just being empathic. So again, this is a very different time than I would argue any of us have ever faced. And there are tough times and there are significant challenges. And we're in a global program like the one that we ran, I might have been in New York working with a program in Australia or in Bangladesh. Now I might be working with an organization right down the block, and I might have used to be able to sit down at a table with them, and now I'm not able to. So I think that there's an element of just remembering that this program or the program that you run needs to be worked on as if you're sitting across the table from somebody, not as if you're behind a computer screen. I just think that level of empathy that you need to bring is critical. And then the last piece, excuse me, is to try to tackle immediate needs and to do that by addressing short-term challenges and low-hanging fruit. And again, I said this before, but this might be short-term projects. It might mean working for an hour or two with an organization instead of doing longer-term projects. But right now, given everything going on, I think that might be the best way to engage employees who feel a little bit time constrained or unsure of what their future looks like, and also to engage nonprofits or organizations that are really just struggling at the moment.
No, thank you. Those are all really important points. And the empathy is obviously like very, very top of mind for all of us and very important. Well, thank you so much for joining me by the fire today, Dan. It was great chatting with you a bit. I know we're running up on time here, so just wanted to quickly close things out with just a quick recap and then some resources. So like we were just talking about, be really explicit with your expectations and objectives, both from a programmatic design perspective as well as with participants. Ensure that roles are really carefully defined. Provide participants with those curated resources and be really directive about it so that they don't have to spend time thinking about the nitty gritty, but they can just dig into the work. And encourage flexibility, empathy, and excellent communication. Over communication is the way that we need to operate now. And first and foremost, just think about this as something that doesn't have to be incredibly complicated. It can be pretty simple. Just want to think through some of the nitty gritty there, but it doesn't have to feel unbearably hard. We're here to support you in any way we can. So a few resources are highlighted here. We'll also be versus we minutes here. And Lindsay and I will test me.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Lindsay, I can hear you. I couldn't hear Jenny.
Okay. All right. I'm hoping it might just be limited to Jenny's Wi-Fi. So it's good timing for us to quickly ping pong back over to get to a few of the great questions that were put into the Q&A. And for any that we don't get to, we'll make sure we can follow up when we circle back post-webinar with the recording as well. So jumping to a few of these questions I know are going to be relatable to most people on the line. Some great questions from Maddie Hutchinson and from Kim Carey-Tyerman, thinking about how to better understand the specific needs organizations have right now, and if they're really prepared to and frankly desiring of having this support. So a few quick things up front I think will be helpful here. One is with outreach that Taproot did right off the bat to help understand the types of needs that organizations that we work with were having and what their time horizon was. The most consistent responses we got from organizations that needed a moment was that they needed about 45 to 60 days. And I want to be clear, we were reaching out to organizations across just about every issue area type, since as you can imagine, basically every nonprofit organization is being dramatically impacted by this pandemic. The difference just might be that their direct programs or issue area aren't necessarily healthcare related or food access related, but instead they've had their main fundraiser for the year canceled, or all their programming was in person and they now are no longer able to reach their constituency, et cetera. So many organizations, from going back about 2 weeks ago, said they needed 45 to 60 days. And what Taproot's doing is following up when we hit that mark in order to do an additional survey to find out what would have been needed at the time so we can help with resiliency in the future and to dig in with the types of projects that are needed then. That said, for the organizations that are in need and ready to go right now, there are two main things we encourage you to consider. One is be very thoughtful about the issue area of the organizations that you are partnering with or reaching out to serve. As you mentioned, funding across the board is the top need, but specifically with organizations whose mission and services are directly related to addressing needs related to COVID-19, they might have a different set of needs. The ones I'm going to reference right now are the ones that we found are most universally needed across just about every type of nonprofit organization. And it's actually linked in one of the resources you see here with our summary of the top 5 ways you can help. So specifically thinking through financial reforecasting, as that's a need organizations have right now, and they will continue to have in a significant way over the course of the remainder of the year and beyond. Crisis communications, very timely for many organizations who understandably are not equipped to be able to shift their communications this rapidly and need to in order to reach their constituency and let people know how they can get the support they need. Shifting program to virtual delivery is very new territory for a lot of organizations. And for many of them, that's their only lifeline to be able to reach the folks that they're trying to help. And frankly, to also connect with the donors, volunteers, and others who help keep their organization alive and running. And creative fundraising campaigns. Now, this might, for many organizations, be top of mind right now, but the actual implementation of it might come at a later time. But it's something that, again, is going to be a very universal need among organizations who have, in many cases, lost the majority of their funding for the remainder of the year due to the cancellation of events and activities, or due to the fact that they garnered a lot of their support through registrations for programming, ticket sales, et cetera. You'll be able to link to more detailed summary within the resources that Jenny's provided here, but those are a few categories that we already know from connecting with organizations are pretty universally needed right now and will continue to be over the course of the next year. In addition, on the constraint side, many organizations right now, frankly, are struggling to keep their doors open, keep their employees paid, or navigate what happens if they can't. And picking up on another question about some of the best ways to identify the types of needs your organizations have, to the extent you can, piggyback on the surveying and research that other groups like Taproot and other foundations have already done. That way, you're not asking additional time of your organizations by responding to your questions. That said, if it's the best way for you to get a more targeted set of answers with the organizations you're serving, really limit yourself to short, direct surveys, 3 to 5 questions at most. Be very targeted in what you're asking for, because every moment you're asking of a team member at an organization is probably a minute being taken away right now from critical services or fundraising initiatives to help them stay afloat. And then in addition, picking up on one more question here to tie a few of these pieces together. When you think about what is going to be the helpful format for reaching organizations, obviously you heard the examples that Jenny and Dan provided about the way different types of virtual programming can come to life. One thing to consider that relates to one of the questions here about the ways to connect through consulting or through those more short-term or immediate hits. Is finding ways both in the outreach to your employees, as someone referenced, and in the way you're connecting with nonprofits to meet people where they are, to ensure that you can have a 1-hour consultation if that's something that is an option for you and for your employee base, and not think of it only as an all or nothing scenario. Even if the program you ran in the past was team-based, was long-term, this is a really valuable opportunity for not just your employees, of course, but for the nonprofit professionals who also right now don't have a lot of time and bandwidth to get an initial quick answer on something they need to work their way through, and then probably have the chance to circle back for some more in-depth support when there's more opportunities to be able to do so. So a few quick answers to some of the questions posted here. Jenny, should I ping pong back to you? I know we're at 2 o'clock to wrap up, but anything else to add?
We're right at time here. I think one thing we'll just add is if your question wasn't addressed, we'll be following up with you to be able to answer that. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you do have any other questions that come up for you afterwards. We're here as a resource. We understand that your time is also very valuable and limited. So appreciate you spending your time here with us today, and we're here to support however we can as you're navigating how to best engage and support the communities that you care most about. So thank you very much, and we'll be following up with a recording and some resources.
Thanks, everybody.